Do you know which chess tournament is largely considered to be the greatest tournament of all time? Well, in today's video here on Forward Chess, we are going to be looking at the 1953 Zurich International Tournament, a candidates tournament where 15 of the strongest players at the time battled it out over a 30-round robin tournament to play for the World Championship title against Botvinnik. Let's take a look. Now, back in the day, it was super common for top players to write tournament books about the tournaments that they played in. The top ones, of course, because the quality of chess was amazing. And in these books, you would find deep analysis about the games. And this 1953 Zurich tournament was no exception. David Bronstein, one of the strongest players to never become world champion, wrote this tournament book, and now it is finally on Forward Chess. We're going to take a look at the tournament and the book, and specifically one of the super great games. So a little bit about a background of this tournament. As I've mentioned, it is considered to be one of the greatest tournaments of all time. Strong players, 15 of them in the candidates. Nowadays, we have 8 players. So 30 rounds, it's quite a marathon. And in this specific tournament, we had a lot of great players, including Smyslov, Geller, Boleslavsky, Bronstein, Naidov, Sabo, Keres, Kotov, Gligorich, Reshevsky, Taimanov, Oive, Petrosian, Averbach, and Stelberg. Now, you probably recognize a lot of these names, former world champions. We have openings named after quite a few of them. And just generally, it was an incredibly strong tournament where Smyslov would end up winning and getting to challenge Botvinnik for the title. So we're going to take a look at one of his games against Oive. And of course, you probably know, if you know your chess, who Oive is. He was world champion in 1935, the 5th world champion, and of course later became FIDE president and whatnot. But in this specific tournament, he was, one of the top players, but they all were really strong. I mean, it was a candidates tournament, basically. So let us dive in. Let me show you the book on Forward Chess, first of all. It is a wonderful place to, I guess, work through a book like this, because as we know, chess books can be difficult to read. I've said this many times. And having a platform like Forward Chess where you have your board next to the book, especially in a book like this where you are looking at games. I'll show you what the platform looks like, but over here, Zurich International, you just type it in and this book will come up. It gives you a little bit of a background and also notes some important games to look out for. There are a lot of good ones. This is an incredibly strong tournament, but I want to say that this book is really great for all levels, right? Because the analysis is done by Bronstein, who had, first-hand experience as a player here. He came tied second. And as you can see, it's really conveniently done. You've got all the rounds, 30 rounds. This is just crazy. But anyways, 30 rounds. There were a lot of great games. Let me show you what we will be going to look at. We are going to see round 3, Oive Smyslov. But as you can see on Forward Chess here, you can have the book right next to you with the board over here. You can make arrows, highlights, all the things, choose your colors, and have some engine analysis, which is great, I think, for a book like this, especially where analysis was done pre-engine times. They did not have the computers that we have now, but of course, the analysis is still pretty deep and it is great to work through. So let us take a look at this game on the web reader. So here we are on the Forward Chess web reader, which is very easy to access. And you can just go from the home page to your web reader, open up your library of books, and head to this one. I'm specifically on round 3 of the tournament, Oive Smyslov. Now, I've already given you a little bit of background on Oive, world champion, FIDE president, Smyslov, how you pronounce it. Smyslov was an incredibly great player as well. He would become world champion later on. After winning this Zurich International, he went on to challenge Botvinnik a year later, but unfortunately, the match would end in a tie, a draw. So that meant that Botvinnik kept the title, retained the title. But Smyslov, who was a candidate multiple times, would go on to win the 1956 edition and would challenge Botvinnik once again in 1957, and there he would win and become world champion. So this is basically him kind of on the precipice of his greatness. You know, he's already a super strong player, but he is eyeing that title. He's playing this very long tournament with so many strong players. And now in round 3, he is playing with the black pieces against Oive. Let's take a look. Smyslov here is playing as black, and we have a Grunfeld. So c4, g6. I'll just play off the first moves pretty quickly. The idea of Grunfeld is you give white the center, but you are going to take it back as black. So white has these really nice central pawns, but the common way of black attacking us in the center is via c5, just dismantling these pawns. And Smyslov was a frequent Grunfeld player. There's going to be some more interesting facts on this later, but a lot of theory in this specific line. This white pawn, let's use our arrows over here. This white pawn is going to come down and aim to get to d6, where it kind of becomes a thorn in the position for black. But black gets good counter chances, and I think both sides were pretty happy with the outcome of the opening. Let's continue. d5, white keeps the central pawns, e6. And it's this point at e6 where white can choose to push forward, keep the pawn. Of course, black doesn't want to trade on d5 because that just gives white a very strong pawn, pass pawn. And they leave the tension in the center for a little bit. Castle, castle, and now a4. So very interesting is that Oive had played this line before, and in his previous game, instead of playing a4, he brought the knight out to c3. Now, of course, they would analyze the games, and their analysis was kind of like, public, and tournament books as well, as I said, a very common way. They did not have this database that was easy to access online. So tournament games were spoken about in these tournament books. And Oive analyzed this specific line, which Smyslov knew about but went into anyways, which Bronstein here notes as super interesting because you're going into someone's preparation that they've already improved. But Smyslov is like, let's see where this goes. And that's exactly what happened. Oive, in this previous tournament book, noted that this is the best continuation, and this is how they played. a4, knight a6, knight a3, takes, and now we have traded off a bit. Black's pieces are active at least, and this d-pawn is not much of a problem yet. Knight c3, There is a lot of analysis, but we are not going to really get into it right now. Of course, if you go through the book and you see this, I would highly suggest you do read the analysis. It is very insightful, of course, since Bronstein himself has done it. Knight b4, bishop e3. Now, Bronstein notes that Oive was expecting a defense such as the knight coming to d7 to defend the c5 pawn, and after queen d2, white would be happy. But instead, Smyslov plays what the author says an active defense. Let me highlight that. With rook c8. Now, keeping the pieces in the game, bishop d3 is coming, the rook is defending, but actively. So, now we get to the moment where this little pawn push comes to play. d6 is on the board, and bishop d3, white occupies this strong square, breaking the communication between the queen and the pawn, allowing bishop takes b7. And now, I said we weren't going to get into analysis, but there's a really nice line that is shown here where Bronstein mentions that a5 was actually an important move to include. And I will show you why. So a5, the bishop wants to take on b7, but this a5 pawn needs to be able to get to a6 to defend it on b7. So a5 would be met with bishop takes f1, king takes f1, knight d7, bishop takes b7, rook b8, and a6. Even though white is the exchange down, white has the bishop pair and a bishop pair that is extremely active. So it is definitely, there's definitely compensation for white on the board. And okay, both sides have really good chances here. Instead, white captured on b7 first. After rook b8, bishop retreats, and white gives up this rook anyway. King takes on f1, knight c7. As I said, the exchange was given, but still we're in a position where the two bishops are very active, and white is pretty much banking on this d6 pawn to become very important later on, as you know, it already is pretty important. Let's continue. Knight c4, knight e5, knight takes, bishop takes c5, and this feels a little bit dangerous because white has two pawns in a piece for the rook, and of course one of the pawns is this d6 pawn. So it feels like white is somewhat in the driver's seat, but this pawn on d6, although it's a passed pawn, although it's very much advanced, it's still pretty weak because it doesn't have a pawn protecting it. And in one of our previous forward chess videos, which we'll link down below, we spoke about pawn structures and how passed pawns and isolated pawns, they can be used like as a distraction. But in this case, it is one of white's main points in the position, right? And what black is going to do, what Smyslov does here, is just uses it against white as a weakness. And let's see how this plays out. Bishop e3, rook fd8, knight e4, bishop takes d6. Now, this pawn captured, but what will come next is a really pretty combination from both sides. White does something very nice, and you'll see it just now. White has given up the pawn, but white has some active pieces. This black king is pretty open. King h8, bishop d4, and there seems to be some really dangerous attack here. But let's see. After bishop e5, now this is a moment where white has quite a nice move, and we call it in chess a Zwischenzug, which is the German word for an in-between move. So instead of capturing or moving the queen out of the way, white plays this very nice knight d7. Now, what is the idea of knight d7? First of all, I'm attacking your bishop twice now. And secondly, if you capture my knight, let's look at this. If you capture my knight, now your rook is hanging. So after bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, queen takes d7, and white is fine here. White is a lot better than a few moments ago. So let's go. Knight d7. This is a critical point in the position for both sides. And black follows it up with f6. Now, there's analysis done on queen a6, which also seems logical, but white obtained a better endgame. Check this out. We're going to go right back to the game that happened. So after f6, defending the bishop, some trades happen, and now queen d2. The position is complicated for both sides, but now this pretty knight on d7, well, it's causing some problems for white because of the pin. And it becomes a little bit annoying, and really it becomes a big reason for white's loss. So let's take a look at what happens. Queen d2, rook bc8, black's final piece comes into the game to a more active position. King g1. As mentioned, this king, the white king, is a lot safer in the position in the game, which helps compared to black's super open king, which becomes a bit of an issue later, but not that much because black plays really well. Queen c5, a brilliant resource which white overlooked, Bronstein says. The black queen, instead of just sitting pretty on the side of the board, enters the game. Of course, if you take my queen, I take your queen, and my rooks are a lot more active. But black's next idea is to just start putting pressure on this knight that is pinned over here. And that's exactly what happens after bishop h3. White starts just defending this knight. Queen e7, coming back. Because remember, black is already in exchange up, so really white lost the compensation for the trade. So if I give it back, but win a piece as well, then I'm just a piece up, right? And this is what happens. Queen e2, white steps off of the pin, and Oyvind thought maybe rook d1 would be better, but it would still be very complicated because, you know, this rook is still coming into the game and the knight is still just not happy. So nevertheless, this knight was never going to live very long. Queen e2 captures, and now black is just a piece up. But it is not a simple piece up, because look at how open, let me change my colors. Look at how open this king is. And this is what happens. The checks, they start coming. This feels dangerous. You know, black has this obvious material advantage, but in such an open position, you have to be extremely careful. And Bronstein calls this win a matter of technique, which is exactly what's going to happen. Keep in mind, at this point, both players are also in a bit of time trouble. So black just has to be careful, and all white would want to play for is this like repetition and try to get a draw, which in an open position like this is definitely possible. But black nevertheless continues really well. So let's look. The fulfillment of this plan requires exceptional restraint, deep calculation, and rapid assessment of the positions that occur along the way. This is what Bronstein says about black's plan, which will be to avoid exchanging queenside pawns, of course, because this will give white a pass pawn over here, to find shelter for the king, a little bit trickier, but our queen can shelter the king, to bring the knight to the king side, and finally to attack the white pawns at f2 or b2, or b3 if the pawn scooches up. So this is what Bronstein says is the plan that black is going to go for, and it is exactly what Smyslov executes. So queen e4, white starts hitting black's weaknesses. a5, outpost knight, h4, queen d5. Of course, if the queens are traded, black is very happy, and it should be a straightforward win, because this white queen is white's most active piece, and it's the one piece that can execute any sort of drawing technique. Queen g4, white says no thank you. Rook f8, rook d1. Finally, this rook comes into the game on move 37. Queen f3, once again trying to trade queens. No thank you. Queen c4, queen f7, and this is how black is trying to, first of all, shelter the king, second of all, trade queens, but at the same time, executing threats of their own. So, queen c5, defending this f2 pawn, queen f5, and remember, this is what Bronstein says, that attacking the pawns is important. These are the weaknesses. These are the pawns that are not defended and targets. Queen f5, queen c4 check, queen f7. Here they're repeating, and of course white would have been very happy if the repetition continued. But at this point, they are in time trouble, and black doesn't go for the threefold repetition, but instead comes up with king g7. So black hasn't achieved much, except, placing pressure on this f2, so on this f2 pawn and tying the queen to the pawn, but the position has to progress in some way. And in order to do that, if we go back to what Bronstein said about the plans, this knight has to come into the action. Let's take a look. Queen d4, queen f6, queen c5, rook f7, rook d2, queen e7, with the threat of this queen coming to e1. Queen c3, check, rook f6. Now instead of my queen just blocking all the checks, my rook can, which is a little bit better. I want to use my queen. Rook d4 and knight c6. Finally, this knight is coming to the king's side. Rook d5, now this rook is pinned. Queen e6, rook c5. It is admirable how white is also trying, attacking and going for certain ideas instead of just kind of staying back, trying to have a little fortress around the king. But with a very, very good execution, black takes it further, because white kind of is running out of moves. I mean, you just have two pieces, and black can sit and be patient. b3, king f7. I'm taking my king off of this pin. Rook b5, queen d7. Again, at any point, my queen, would love to start attacking from the first rank as well. King g2, queen e7. Coming back, I want to get the checks. Queen c4 check, king g7. Black has fortunately secured the king. And worst case scenario, and why this h5 move was so nice, is that the king can always come sit on h6 if necessary. Queen d3, and this is what happens the exact next move. Rook d5, rook f7, rook d6. Attacking, not just sitting back. Now double whammy, the knight and the pawn, but knight e5. My knight's finally coming into the game as an active piece and in a good defensive role. Queen e3 check, king h7, rook b6. Basically, white doesn't have much at this point since black has steadily come to the king's side, and after queen c7, white resigned. And yeah, this is just not a great move, if not a great position. If, let's say, f3 is played, obviously blocking the knight from coming in, blocking the knight from coming to g4 as well. Well, now my queen comes in via c2. And I don't know, this is just a beautiful, beautiful game. The way that black slowly maneuvered, found the correct plan, but how white was also fighting. Like, you can see the quality of chess. It's not just a walkover. And black would go on to win the game, 58 moves, a very long game as well, and a very tense game. So this is just one example from 30 rounds. And you can look at it, do the math yourself. A lot of games, okay? And a lot of good games. Yes, it looks like we have a few draws, as with any high-level tournament, but a lot of decisive games too. In some of the rounds, like round 5, almost every game here was decisive. So the chess in here is just extremely high level. And as a beginner, it's great to read the analysis. As an intermediate, advanced, even playing the games out on forward chess, there is this guess the move feature. So you can choose which color to play with. This was, as you saw, a very high level game. But this is just one out of many. We have, 30 rounds here? 30 rounds, 7 games per round, just an extremely high level of chess. And although it looks like, if you can see here, a lot of draws happening, some of these rounds had a lot of decisive games. Like, look at round 5, where 5 of the 7 games were decisive, and 4 of the 5 were decisive by black. So, interesting stuff here. As a beginner, the analysis is amazing. Bronstein goes deeply, but not too deeply, so it's really understandable. And as an intermediate or advanced player, it's great to, first of all, study the analysis, look at the games, learning from top players from the time. As a beginner or an intermediate player, you can play against the computer with forward chess's guess the move feature. And you're basically making a move for the player. And I think in a book like this, where there are literally top games, top players, it's a really good place to practice. So that is it for today. This is the first book that we are talking about, the actual games in a tournament setting. But and this was only the first game. So I want to look at a few more games. Let me know in the comments in this book which game we should go through next. And as always, see you next time.